All right, so I was going to talk about typography. All right, so typography is kind of an interesting thing. Basically, is both a description of the fonts themselves aesthetically, and it's also about the creation of an application therein of type. Okay, so but more or less, it's just all about type and fonts. And basically, what I kind of want to draw attention to is the fact that, like, when you write text, it has a literal meaning, right? So, like, if I write typography, it literally means what this is. But the way that it's written, what font choice you make, affects how it's interpreted. So, for instance, if I write "You're invited," if you look at this first one, what does it make you think of? You think of some sort of formal engagement, like a wedding, right? It has that kind of feel. It's got that handwritten, fanciful, kind of sharp, tight text. If you look at this one, it makes you think of like a birthday party, like a little kid's birthday party, right? Because if you look at it, it's very round and bubbly. The colors are kind of silly. Now, if you look at the last one, it means you probably shouldn't go wherever you're being invited, right? It's kind of like a blood font or something. I mean, it might make sense if it was for a Halloween party or something, but it's a little bit more, I think it might be even called Chiller or something, this font. But it's a little more threatening, right? Because although they all say the exact same thing, each one implicitly says something else about what you're writing. And so that's something you have to kind of take into account. Certain types of fonts and colors and things like that will give an impression to your reader about what they're reading. Okay. Now, I'm not going to cover the anatomy of type, but just be aware that if you were in like a 4-year school and you were going for graphic design or web design, you would literally, one of your classes, you would have a whole semester on just typography. Like, that'd be the name of the class or something like that. And all you would talk about is type and like the anatomy of type and how to use type. You probably make a font family. You would do a whole thing. If you click on this little link here, if this is something you're interested in, this actually talks about the anatomy of type and like how you would describe it. Like where the baseline is the baseline. X height is the height of the lowercase letters. These are the serifs, the little nucks on each one of the little things there. I'm not going to go through it, but just be aware that if it's something you want to look at, you can look at it there. There's also type classification. So, here's another thing on type that's interesting. And basically, it's a very small article. I thought it was a lot more. Oh, here we go. Which is more kind of like the anatomy thing again, like the previous one. Now, when we talk about type, probably we find more useful than even these elements, although these might be useful for you as well, especially if you plan on pursuing web design or graphic design, something you should look into. You can generally break down fonts or font families into a couple of categories, if you will. Okay, meaning that like font, like all these text forms belong to this font family, and all of these text forms belong to another font family. It's just a way of dividing them up. It's especially useful because if you're trying to look for something, then you know to like look at these types of fonts. So for instance, when we were doing the fonts.google.com, you'll notice that they had these categories right here. So if I'm trying to look for certain kinds of fonts, I can do it quickly that way. And other things will have that as well. Like if you go to what's that called? Defonts.com? Something like that. I don't know if I wrote that right. Might be Defont.com. Might be .org. Yeah. If you go to font.com, you'll see that they have fancy techno. They have these other ways of describing them as well. There is no like perfect, like this is the way that everybody categorizes them. So what I did is I just kind of took like the most common, and then you can kind of describe it in your own way. So the first type is serif fonts. Basically, they have the extra little bits. So see like the extra little nuck on the S here, little extra tail on the R. See how the feet have like they kind of come out on the bottom. Those are actually called serifs. Okay. This was not, although this looks like the oldest of all the types, this is actually not the oldest. Serifs were added on later on when people were writing large amounts of text, like for newspapers is where you will most commonly see it, and also in books. It's really good for long pieces of text, and I believe that the reason why is because when you have these little lines, these feet and other elements, it helps them stay more cohesive. The baseline is a lot easier to see on long forms of text. So it's really commonly used for that. However, generally speaking, for digital stuff, serifs are not really that great. The reason being is that when this gets really small, I don't know if you're going to be able to, I can only get it so small. Those extra little nucks on there, they're going to get kind of more muddied up because it's a less clean font, okay? So they don't look as good smaller. They look good small on a printed page, but not on a digital page because there's only so many pixels, okay? Sans serif is basically without serifs, okay? And generally speaking, you can break down all fonts into just these two categories. You know, you can take the rest of these and call them one of these two as well, but anyway, sans serif are the cleanest ones. Basically, it's what the most basic that you would see. So serif, some examples would be like Times New Roman, or I was going to say Courier, but I don't think Courier is. What is the one that, whatever the default that if you're in Word, typically those are the ones that you're going to see that are serif, because you know you're going to type stuff out and then you would print it typically. Sans serif are ones that are completely clean. They work really well for they're very minimalist, and they work pretty well for the digital world, and they're really good for small text in the digital world because when you shrink it, it's only the bare bones of what needs to be seen there, so they shrink the best out of any font. They can be the smallest. They're not bad for body text. Neither one of these are really too bad. For digital, I'd probably do some sort of sans serif. What I am using is Roboto, which is like the most common one on Google Fonts. But you'll see like Arial is a sans serif. That's pretty common. Helvetica is a really clean one, but there's a bunch of sans serif, and basically it's just a really clean, minimalistic font. Monospace is a special typeface that honestly you don't usually see all that often. The idea is that every letter is the same width. So if you look at this M, it's the same width as this O, which is the same width as this N. O, if you look, every letter is the same width. That's why it's called monospace, okay? It was more built on a necessity. So for instance, if you had typewriters, you couldn't have different size keys because when the typewriter comes up, it has those little keys on the end of the buttons that it would stamp onto the paper. Well, each one of them has to be the same size so that when they type, it would line right up to the next one. So that's actually the reason kind of why it exists. It's not really the nicest looking unless you have a specific need for it. I don't generally suggest it. What you'll do is you'll see them used today in two main things. One is encoding. The reason why we use encoding is because there's no kerning. Like the letters aren't, like some letters aren't smaller and thicker and you know, wider and shorter, and they're not being smudged up against each other. It'll make your lines of code, if they're exactly the same, they'll line up perfectly. So it makes the code very organized looking because they're all exactly the same width. So it's a little bit easier to read. The other thing you'll see it in is scripts. So in scripts, they use like Courier or Courier New typically as a monospace. And the reason why you see it in scripts, and when I say scripts, like, you know, like for movies or television, is because when you write a page in a movie or television, each page is 1 minute, meaning it's 1 minute of film time, okay? Now, if you use one of these other kinds of fonts, you might be able to shove more words on a page or less words on a page because just of the letters that happen to be in what you wrote. But if you use monospace, it's always going to contain the same number of letters regardless. And so it makes it more consistent that one page of written text on a script will be 1 minute. So if you have a script and it's 120 pages, that's a 2-hour movie. All right, and that's kind of how they organize it. So those are really the only two things you're typically going to see them in. Most of the time you don't see those two. Script can also mean like handwriting, or sometimes they'll call it cursive. And basically it's just meant to mimic, you know, writing text by hand. So, I mean, it's kind of straightforward. If you look at here, they call it handwriting. So that's another way. But basically, if I turn these other ones off, you can see it's just stuff that's meant to look like you wrote it by hand, okay? And there's a nicety in it. You know, it's very inviting. It feels more personal. But it's also very hard to read. It's probably one of the hardest to read out of all of them. So unless there's, like, again, a specific need for it, you know, you can use it as, like, your title fonts or to highlight something as an accent. But generally speaking, I wouldn't use it too much. Display is a really broad term. It means everything else. Sometimes they'll call it decorative or fantasy. What else do they call it? What do they call it here? Oh, they call the display here. But, you know, fancy. They'll call it a bunch of different things. But basically, it's your random fonts that are, like, weird and different looking, and they're really interesting. But if you had to read, like, a full paragraph of this font, you'd have difficulty with it. So they only work as title fonts. So meaning, like, it's a couple of words or it's one line and nothing more than that. So typically your headings and stuff like that, you'll use a display font, you know, use a display or a script. But any body text, you're typically going to use this serif or sans serif. Now, some other ways that we describe type, both as paragraph and individually letters, is some spacing. So letter spacing is just the space between letters. And we can describe that by tracking. Tracking is the space between each letter, like, all together. So if you look at this one's tracking, there's a lot of space in between. If this one's tracking, there's not a lot of space in between. Kerning is actually individually between different letters. So typically auto kerning is on when you type. So if these were monospaced, these two letters, you can see this A and W do not have a very strong association because this W ends here and the A ends here. So there'd be an invisible line, especially if we were on a typewriter, right? But if it's auto-kerned, what'll happen is it will shove the W closer like this and give them better association. So the word doesn't, because this almost looks like this is the end of a word and the start of a word. This looks like it's part of the same word. And that's kerning. Word spacing is the space between words. So a lot of space between words, you know, not a lot of space between words. Alignment, so you can have center, left, right, justified. So here's left, center, and here's right. Okay. Generally speaking, don't use center alignment. It's the weakest of all the alignments. You want to use left or right. Typically you use left just because people read left to right. If you need to use right alignment, that's fine. But if you want to try and use alignment regardless, okay? If you use center alignment, unless you have a very specific reason, don't do it. Rag is the opposite edge of alignment. So right here is justified. On both ends here. So notice that it's got like a nice straight line here and a nice straight line here. Notice this one's got a strong left alignment, but it's not on this side, okay? That is called the rag. So it's what ends up happening when you don't have when you don't justify and put it on both sides. Now, you get another thing which I didn't put in here. It's called a valley. And basically, notice that, like, in order for this to be justified, there's a bigger space right here, and a really big one here, and a big one here. And when you get like a couple in a row, it creates like it creates like these holes in the paragraph, which is not generally considered good. So believe it or not, doing left alignment like this, although we do get rag on the right side, is actually considered better than doing justified. Although if you had to choose, you know, both are still better than center alignment, because center alignment would have ragged edge on both ends, and that's no good. An orphan is just when you have like a remaining word. There's another thing called a widow, which is basically when you just have like the end of something. You just have a couple of words at the end of a paragraph. This is if you have like just one word at the start of a paragraph. So layout, generally speaking, when you're laying out your text, you can click on this little link here. Oh, it's not a link. Oh, I thought it was a link. The way that we value things is to make things have more emphasis is size. So obviously, the larger the text, the more it's going to be. We're going to look at it more. Our first weight, obviously, making text bolder draws more attention. Spacing. If you put space around a bit of text, it's going to pop out more than text that doesn't have space around it. And obviously, color adding to text will draw it as opposed to something that's black and white. Another thing we use is the grid, which I think I kind of talked about before. You can click on this little designer's guide to grid theory. It's not a bad article. But the idea is that we use columns, gutters, and rows. So a column would be, each line coming down, a row goes across, and the gutter is the space between columns. So it's the white lines in between. So obviously if you look at here, this is the gutter, right? If we didn't have a gutter, this paragraph would butt up right against this and be impossible to read. So that's what the gutter is. All right, so you can see like this is, so each one of these is a row, 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 and you can see, you know, here's a column and here's a column. All right. So choosing and applying type. How much more we got here? Oh, okay. So paragraphs. So if you're doing paragraphs, you want to generally follow these. If you're doing headings, generally want to follow these. You want to try and choose fonts that the letters have similar widths, that there's not like one letter's got really wide and one's really thin. You don't want them overly thin or overly fat. You want them kind of in the middle-ish. Avoid tall or short lettercase, meaning the X height. So when it's the lowercase letters are not like tall. You don't want round O's. So basically, if you have an O and it's a circle, that's no good. It's just it doesn't appear very well. You want you do not want matching B's or D's or P's or Q's. They should all be unique. Uneven stroke thickness. Don't use decorative fonts. Spacing. Headings. Obviously, that's the thing you want to draw your attention. Think about who it's for. You know what I mean? So if you're doing children, you know, usually want to do something that's going to fetch their eye. If you're doing older people, they're going to want more professional type. So children will want usually round, bubbly, decorative fonts. Adults, like if I'm doing a bank, I want to do like a strong, like this, very blocky, rectilinear fonts, right? And if I'm doing something that's like edgy, I would do something that's more sharp and triangular. Depending on the message of what we're trying to say, you know, the bank's text should show strength. An ice cream truck should be really colorful. If you're using a picture, sometimes you can use the picture as a guide to what your font's going to be. So if you're doing like a nature, if your picture is like a tree or something, you know, maybe using a handwritten font, you know, or a cursive font might actually, or a script font might be beneficial because it kind of looks like branches, you know what I mean? Or even using a serif font. But if I was going to use like real graphic, you know, strong, you know, like apple looking kind of like thick blocky things, then I probably would use a sans serif font that's kind of blocky and what have you. You know, you have to kind of take a note from what your artwork looks like, you know, your images and that sort of stuff, and then use that and make sure they kind of match. Watch this, because this is actually kind of fun. I'm not going to watch it with you because that's stupid. Then we're watching a video instead of a video, and that, you know, get into Inception. But watch this video because it's cool. It's basically they show different ways of arranging text to kind of push the meaning. All right, so your next assignment is to add the intra-site homepage content. So you should have basically the layout at this point where you kind of have your structure. Now what I want you to do is go through and add the content. So write the actual written content that you want it to be, right? I'm going to be looking at grammar and stuff, so make sure there's no major mistakes. Make sure all the images are scaled and adjusted for the size. You might have to like desaturate some so that they match better or push values. If there's any rich media, so if you're embedding video or maybe like Font Awesome, any sort of interactive stuff, you can put them in there. Make sure you embed your Google fonts, right? That's a requirement. And then just generally that the aesthetics look nice. But you should have more or less your finished home page. And do a good job on this because that's what you're going to use to build your subpages. So the nicer this one looks, the better your subpage is going to look. Yeah. All right. There you go. And I don't really have a tutorial video on it because, I mean, you're just putting in your content, so you should know how to do that. All right. Good luck.